Experience the most efficient system for delivering sulfur and phosphate to meet your crop's needs with Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST.
Welcome back to Real Agriculture and Real Ag Radio. I am your host, Lindsay Smith, and joining me now is Wade Sobkowich. He's the Executive Director of the Western Grain Elevators Association. Wade, welcome here. I wish it was under better circumstances.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We do too. I do too. But here we are dealing with another labor situation affecting the grain industry that we need to figure out how to get through one way or another.
So, fresh off railway issues. Now we are on to the ports. So as of today, so as of 7 Pacific time, we did receive word that workers did go on strike. Just catch us up on the actors here and what happened today.
So today at 7 o'clock a.m. Pacific time, the Grain Workers Union and their approximately 650 members started strike action against the 6 grain terminals in Vancouver. So that is Cargill, Richardson's, G3, Pacific Elevators, Alliance Grain Terminal, and Cascadia Terminal. So they started job action and they started picketing at those facilities. So those operations at those facilities are effectively shut down.
So, okay, so point of clarification, because there are, of course, several different groups and unions that work at our ports. We often talk about, when we talk about logistics issues, that grain movement is deemed essential. How does that fit into this? There are certain things that still would have to happen, but can they still if the workers are on strike?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's a question I get a lot. So essentially, it stems from a provision in the Canada Labour Code. So that's the place to start this conversation. Clause 87.7 of the Canada Labour Code says something to the effect that during a strike in the longshore sector, so that's not grain workers, that's the longshore sector, right? Stevedoring companies we're talking about. During a strike in that sector, workers and members of the union have to continue the tie-up, let-go, and loading of grain vessels from licensed grain terminal facilities.
Okay.
So that's the provision, something along those lines. And so when we say grain is essential, what they mean is as it relates to the longshore industry, it's a bit nonsensical in the sense that if grain is essential, then why isn't it essential everywhere? If it stops anywhere along the supply chain, it stops regardless of whether workers are available to load it onto boats or not. Mm-hmm. So, but that's the provision. So during the ILWU strike, we saw in Vancouver not that long ago, the stevedores had to continue to load grain vessels. And in fact, we've come to understand that they don't necessarily dislike that provision because it allows them to continue to cycle people into paid positions while being on strike. So there's some benefit to workers in that case. In this case, we're talking about the Grain Workers Union, Local 333, and we're talking about workers at grain terminal facilities. So yes, it's true that the stevedores would have to be there to load the vessels, but there's nobody at the terminal getting that grain into a position to be loaded onto a vessel.
Okay. Right. Okay. So that's an excellent distinction then. Also, I'm just going to state for the record, stevedoring, not a term that most are familiar with. There's a lot of these nautical terms that we're learning through this strike. So right, there's a difference between those that would be moving the ships in and out and those that are actually, and that's the grain workers that would actually be loading these vessels. So while they are on strike, it means that no grain moves.
That's right. While they're on strike, no grain moves because no grain can be unloaded from rail cars. No grain can be binned, cleaned, blended, moved through the facility, and put to the spout. And then once it gets to the spout, that's where the stevedores or longshoremen, they're interchangeable. It's their role to load the vessel, to make sure the spout goes into the actual hold of the ship, and grain can be channeled through that spout and loaded onto a vessel, and making sure that the vessel berths properly and that is let go properly. That's the role of the longshoremen or the stevedores.
Okay. So now this question then, so in the details here, so this local 333, the grain workers,
Mm-hmm.
their collective agreement, the last one expired December 31st of 2023 of last year. There have been, so the elevators have made three proposals, three offers to
Mm-hmm.
this union, all of which have been rejected, and there has been no counter offer. Is that a common thing that the union would not come back and negotiate?
It depends on the circumstances. I think the way to think about it is when it comes to collective bargaining, people tend to try and look for right and wrong, but there isn't. It's about leverage and perspective. And so if you can create the conditions that give you the maximum amount of leverage at the right time and run the clock, so to speak, to that point, then you've given yourself a better ability to gain more in the process. So, we have been trying to bargain with the Grain Workers Union since November of 2023 in an attempt to try and get the collective agreement resolved before harvest. But that hasn't happened because it takes two to tango, and you can't necessarily, one party can't control the timeline in isolation. And if somebody else wants to delay and rag the puck, one way to do it is to not make counteroffers or to, slow play the timeline. And that's, in our biased opinion, perhaps, but from where we sit, that's the way this has played out to try and take us to the point where we're in harvest and we're in a peak period. And so here we are. So in an attempt to try and get it resolved before we got to harvest, the employers were motivated to try and get it to completed. And in doing so, they made a number of offers. And I believe the union made one counter offer in the midst of that process, but it wasn't meaningful, and it didn't even acknowledge some of the issues that the employers are raising. Like, for example, employers want the right to not schedule work on statutory holidays.
Okay.
And the union is not in favor of that. That's one of the major sticking points, because if we don't have the grain to load on a vessel, we don't have enough work to do during a statutory holiday. We'd prefer not to schedule them and pay double time for that. So it's those types of things are in play right now, and those are some of the sticking points. But that's part of how we got to this point in time. It's about managing the clock.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is, of course, just on the heels of a major disruption with railways. Where were the elevators, the grain companies, sort of at as far as getting back to moving product into position and moving through? Like, how detrimental is the timing of this to that point?
It's pretty bad. I mean, I guess I would say, I would distinguish between recovery and rebalancing. So when it comes to a rail strike, you never really recover. You've lost tonnage, you've pushed sales out, you've adjusted, and you're now moving less grain, fewer tons within that peak price period from September to February. But it was pretty close to being rebalanced, I would say. So, CN was performing at about 85% of orders, so they were fulfilling 85% of demand on a week-to-week, or at least in the most recent week for which we have data. And CP was closer to 75, 80%. So we were getting there, and of course we always strive for 100%, but here we are again, right? So during that time, we were talking to our customers and going through everything that we needed to go through, and taking sort of the reputational bullets associated with that, and here we are again doing the same thing. But at some point you need to take a stand.
So, and that really, to me, is one of the key questions here. Bigger picture, obviously, there's the immediacy of dealing with a strike, of negotiating between these two organizations. However, Canada's reputation, the reputation of being a reliable supplier, often we talk about this in the context of our railway system, but here we are, as you say, not far out from that, now having to deal with a port issue of not being able to move grain out. How incredibly difficult is this for grain companies to be able to actively go out and sell grain with these kind of stresses, these kind of reliability issues at play?
It's devastating. We just had those conversations with our customers about the rail strike, and now we're having to have them again about a grain workers strike. And a person, a casual observer may look at it and say, well, as grain employers, this is within your control. You should be able to have this resolved and not have to talk to your customers and not have to subject the grain system to another, set of reputational bullets in this discussion. But, at some point you have to take a stand and say, we can't. We've already offered $50 an hour for a janitor, which is the lowest paid position. We've already offered great pension benefits of $7.44 an hour for that same janitor, and that's been refused, and so you see yourself as being taken advantage of, and so yeah, it's a difficult decision to make, but the employers made that decision to say, well, I guess we're going to have to talk to our customers again because we can't, we need a fair deal, or at least what we think is a fair deal. So yes, it's we have a high cost system here in Canada for handling and moving grain. We have a lot of regulation we have to overcome, and we're price takers in the global marketplace. And so we have to at the end of the day, this amounts to a transfer of wealth, let's say, between farmers and the price that they get for the grain and grain workers in what they're asking for in this collective bargaining process. So, it doesn't fully answer your question about our reputation, but it was I guess not path of least resistance, but more of a lesser of two evils, I suppose, type of a decision that the grain employers made.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then finally, we did see the federal government step in quite quickly once the railways did actually go on lockout and strike. Important that there were both of those things happening at once. Do you foresee, would you want government to step in, or would you rather see this go through the bargaining process and be resolved that way?
So in this situation, we think the government has a stake and some ownership in the situation we're in, and I'll explain why. Canada made the decision to put 100% tariffs on electric vehicles coming in from China. And so China, coincidentally, but not coincidentally, is now investigating Canada for its practices on canola exports. So that investigation is going to be completed at some point this fall, and a decision by the Chinese government will be made, and it could result in a ban or some sort of a tariff on canola into China. So as exporters, we're trying to get as many canola vessels out and as early as possible, so we can get them into China before any ban, if that's what ends up happening, comes into effect. The Grain Workers Union knows this, and so it's another lever at their disposal, and it's sort of the best time for them to put pressure on the companies to give more. And so we think that this isn't a situation that we as a grain industry created. This is a trade-off decision the federal government made. It made the decision to protect jobs in Eastern Canada at the cost of canola exports, and returns to farmers in Western Canada at its base level. So from that perspective, we think the government has some responsibility to help us through this situation by whatever means it can. And we're not trying to be specific about that, but we are saying to the federal government, we think you need to be involved here in helping us get through this because the bargaining field is not level anymore. Mm-hmm. It's tipped in favor of the employees in this case.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to say I very much appreciate the time today, because this is, of course, probably one of your busiest all year, I'm gonna guess. So thank you for joining me on the show. Thank you for enlightening us and covering all these things. You've certainly answered my questions, and I really appreciate it, Wade. And we'll check back, see how this unfolds over the coming days.
Sounds good, Lindsay.